Like most people's choices of work, there are lots of reasons, right? For me, there are a few things. One is that I grew up in a family with a lot of emphasis on education. My mother was a school principal, and the education that I received made a very big difference in my life. So in that way, it's always been important to me, and I think that it was always clear to me that education can be very transformative. I've also always been concerned about inequality, and inequality is one of the defining features of the experience of education in the United States. It's possible in the United States to have a tremendously well-resourced, vibrant, interesting schooling experience, where students are known very well by their teachers and cared and loved by the communities they're part of. But it's also possible to be in places with very limited resources, or in places where students don't feel known well at all. So the levels of success that come out of schooling range tremendously, from people who leave before they're finished to people who launch themselves into great social mobility. So schools are a very important place to look if you're interested in inequality. And finally, I worked first as a teacher in schools in New York. And so there, I learned a lot more from my students about the ways inequality shaped their lives in New York. And I also saw how it shaped our classroom. I was in schools with teachers who worked very hard and we had great aspirations for our students, but there were also a lot of barriers that came from inequality in the system. Times that we didn't have resources that we needed, or times that the inequalities in our students' lives shaped what was possible in the classroom. So, I had students who, because their parents were working multiple jobs, couldn't come to school on time because they needed to take care of younger siblings at home, for example. I learned that my students and their families wanted very much to have all of the opportunities that education could provide them, but often there were barriers. Economic ones, ones that came from a very long U.S. history of racism and inequality that got in the way of education being transformative for them in the ways that it had been in my own life. So I chose history as a way to think about that because I thought, in part, it was a kind of work I loved doing, to work with people's stories, to work with a variety of kinds of materials and think about what they mean. And I like writing, and you need to like what you do. But I also thought that we really needed the perspective of a long historical view to understand these problems. Because inequality in the U.S. and racism in the U.S. isn't just about a short-term moment or interaction or decision. It's instead the result of choices that United States residents have made over decades, and sometimes again and again and again, that put resources and power in the hands of some people and keep them out of the hands of others. Racism has changed in the U.S. in some important ways, I think, but I think that a lot of the decisions that the country has made in the last 100 years still have really obvious consequences today. Just to give one example, in the 1930s and in the 1940s, the U.S. government decided to help people become homeowners. But when it did that, and it did that by guaranteeing loans to families to buy homes, it did that in racist ways. It made those loans available to white homeowners, and it made them available to people who wanted to live in white suburban neighborhoods. So African American homeowners were not able to participate in that program. A very few did, but the vast majority were locked out of it. And the process of building equity, building wealth by owning a home, not having to pay rent, but instead being able to save those dollars for your housing, for your family, helped contribute to this tremendous gap we have today in the wealth of white American families versus Black American families.